Welcome to 10 Frames Per Second, podcast about photojournalism by photojournalists, but for everyone. With your hosts Joe Giordano and Molly Roberts. New episodes drop every Tuesday on 10fps.net or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also catch back episodes on WLOI.org, as all episodes are recorded and produced at WLOI Loyola Radio in Maryland.
Welcome back to 10 Frames Per Second. I am Joe Giordano. My co-host Molly is away this week, unfortunately. Our guest today is Jackie Molloy. She's a New York City-based photojournalist. In 2022, she was the winner of the Young Guns 20 Award for Creative Professionals Under 30 globally. She was also listed in the 30 New and Emerging Photographers to Watch. She's been awarded the Like a Women Photo Project and the 7 Mentor Program. She's previously completed a 3-year mentorship with photojournalist Ed Cashy, James Estrin, has attended the New York Portfolio Review. Well, your list is incredible, right? We have Eddie Adams, we have Young Hee Kim Grants, we have everyone from AARP, Washington Post, National Geographic, New York Times Magazine, Wall Street Journal. I can go on for about 5 more minutes, but I'm not. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
So we usually ask all of our guests, begin at the beginning, is cliche, but people really like to know, how did you get involved in photography?
Great place to start. I studied photography at Rochester Institute of Technology. I did study photojournalism with a minor in journalism. It was a Bachelor of Fine Art degree. And, I was kind of always one of those kids that had a camera in my hand, but never knew you could make a profession out of it. And originally I thought I wanted to go to school for graphic design or something like that. And I was going to these portfolio reviews in high school, my senior year, right before applications were due. And there was 5 photos in my portfolio. And one man kind of tore into me and was like, nothing's interesting in this whole book except for these 5 pictures. And I was like, oh, well, maybe that's something. Can I be a photographer? And then I really quickly changed all my college applications and decided to just apply for photography. I had no idea what photojournalism was, which is ironic. And I just kind of read on the descriptions of, at RIT, there's a lot of different kinds of photo programs. There's many of them, and they had photojournalism listed, and it was candid documentary style photography. I mean, I'm sure it said something better than that. I just made that up, but and I was like, that sounds good, and I kind of just clicked it, and that's how I figured out that photojournalism was even a thing. And then when I was accepted and joined the program, it was really a perfect fit. I was like, oh, cool, storytelling, writing, photography, all these things overlapping that I've always liked to do that I didn't know could be merged into this one profession. And then I studied, and when I graduated, I went to the Indy Star for 3 months for the summer Pulliam Fellowship. And then I went to DC at AARP for about 8 months. And then I moved back to New York City and I started freelancing right away. So I've really never had a full-time job outside of internships.
What was your first gig in New York? It's pretty tough in New York. So what was your first gig?
I think my first job was actually for the New York Times, and I got very lucky and I photographed a Greek butcher that's actually in the neighborhood that I still live in.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
When you say you were lucky, you want to expand on it a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that at RIT, they have a phenomenal program. And when you're in your junior year, you go to New York City and you meet with a bunch of professionals and publications. And then in your senior year, you go to DC and do the same thing. I also did a lot of professional development when I was in my junior and senior year. I attended Eddie Adams. I went to portfolio reviews. I went to Northern Short Course. I just kind of attended and went to community events, and I kept in touch with people after. And I think that's the key thing is, the people that you're meeting, you have to build relationships with. And I just kind of maintained them over time and followed up and asked to have coffee and tried to build those out. And when I moved to New York, when I was living in DC just before it, I had made meetings in New York before I moved back there. I'm from Long Island, so I was always wanting to come back to New York. And I was like, hey, how do I figure out a way to do this? And I had set up all these meetings and I was like, I'm going to come here. Is that going to work? Kind of a thing. And it did work, which is great.
Nice. Which photographers do you or did you? Because I'm going to get to your style in a second, and the subject matter, which I think. I mean, watching your Wapal lecture last year was fantastic. Which photographers do you or did you look at for inspiration and styles and things to get where you are now?
I mean, I think it's evolved a lot, right, over the years. I'd say back when I was in school, a lot of Sally Mann, a lot of Gordon Parks, Eleanor Carucci. I think now I admire like Hannah Reyes Morales' work a lot, Chris Donovan's work a lot. I mean, obviously Eugene Richards, like there's like the classics, and then there's kind of some new photographers that are more like in my generation, my community that I really look up to and admire their work.
Cool. So, looking at your other projects on your website and watching your lecture, you have a fantastic gift for empathy, I think, which is it's becoming like gold now, right? It's so precious metal, right? Empathy today is very rare. How do you maintain that empathy with your subjects? And we're going to get to your subjects in a minute because that's another discussion. But how do you is it difficult today? With I mean, day to day photojournalism, being on the grind, whatever, people can get cynical. How do you maintain that empathy you have for your subjects?
I mean, I think it's the most important thing, right? In so many ways, especially with the work that I do. I work with really sensitive topics and usually women that are very vulnerable and mothers and parenting and caregiving. And I think that it's just kind of like the core of like where I'm at and how I start when I like start to develop a relationship with people. I'm a big advocate of I'm a person first, journalist second, photographer third, and that's kind of how I've always worked. I feel like when you're working with people, everyone works differently, right? Some people like to be a fly on the wall. That's never been who I am. I take up way too much space to be a fly on the wall, too much energy, but I like to really communicate with the people that I'm working with and get to know them. And I think that if they're going to open up and tell me their story, then they get to know a part of mine. And I like being in each other's lives and not in obviously in a way that crosses any boundaries, but there's obviously professional ethics involved. But I do think it's really, really important to be able to like get to know people, especially when you're working in such intimate settings. I think consent is huge. I have lots of conversations about what people are comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with in terms of when they're doing different things, letting them know that they can like consent along the way. They can always say no as we're going. So I think like putting those boundaries in place is also really important. And that also helps really build trust with the people that I'm working with.
So how do you teach young photographers empathy? You advise them.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think empathy is a hard thing in so many ways, right? Because it's either like you're either an empathetic person or not that you can't learn empathy. I think people obviously can do that, but I think like I just said, I kind of like start with those core values and I tell them like, you really need to communicate with the people that you're working with and you really need to get to know them. And, you can't assume a story and what it is before you get in the door. You need to like, get to know people, see evolve in front of you and then kind of go from there. I think it's also small things, right? Like FaceTiming a mom on Mother's Day and like calling on birthdays and checking in when hard things happen to see how it's going after. I think it's just like really being a person in so many ways. So, it's hard to kind of like instill that in someone. I feel like you're either like empathetic and sensitive or, you have to learn that more.
So how did you let's talk about your subjects. It's safe to say that majority of your series that are presented are about families and childhood, single parenting.
Yeah.
How did you get into that subject and kind of make it the focus of your over like the focus of your work?
It just kind of happened on accident in so many ways. Like I was in school and I was working on a lot of stories for classes that had to do with family. And I didn't really put it together at the time, but it was just something that I was like very inspired by, really wanted to learn more about. I think I grew up in a very nuclear family on Long Island, which is very like white middle class. And I just was really inspired once I left that setting to like get to know other people in other places, and family seemed like such an interesting way to do it. I had an assignment in class that was like to do a family project, and for that, I had started working with the Larson family, which is a couple and their quadruplets, and that was like has now turned into. I've been working on it now for 10 years, and we can go back into that if you want. But, I just really was attracted to the idea and concept of families. I also struggle from this thing called polycystic ovary syndrome. And it was something that I was told I had at a very young age. And it's one of the leading causes of infertility. So I always wanted to work on stories about fertility and motherhood. So that also kind of like weaved its way in. I don't think in college I knew that quite yet, that all stemmed from something. But yeah, it was something that I was really passionate about, and it's kind of stuck throughout my career. And I obviously photograph a lot of different things, but that has become like my specialty.
Can you talk about, before we get to the Larsons, the natural birth, the single parent, single mother, single father series is fantastic. Can you talk a little bit about I guess, is it a collaboration? Like you mentioned consent earlier, when they see these photographs, or do they see them before they go to the New York Times or to National Geographic, or, can you talk us through the process of working with such a, I don't want to say difficult, but, sensitive subject, personal subject, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, they all start differently. I work with a lot of support groups actually. So for like the Single Moms by Choice series, there's actually a group, and I had written to them and I had inquired about being interested in meeting different women that were single moms by choice or were throughout the process, right? Whether they were like trying actively, were, or already had been for a number of years. So it was nice because they actually put the letter out for me to their members. So everyone who was reaching out to me was like, interested in telling their story, which is like a great place to be. I did like tons and tons of interviews before I narrowed down who I ended up working with, but except for one of the women who I had met in college. But it's nice because like they're already like wanting to tell their story and reaching out to me, which is like a beautiful thing. But every situation is different, right? Other times I'm just producing it and I'm like going through doulas or midwives or doctors or fertility centers, things like that. And initially it usually starts with like a phone call, then a FaceTime. I usually text them like a photo of myself so they know what I look like when I'm going to show up to their house in a couple of days. And it's a lot of kind of like relationship building. In terms of, do they get to see the photos before they publish? Usually they don't. I would say like if there's a birthday party or a baby shower, that might vary slightly, and I might give them a couple just to have as like a memento in the moment. But or like when a baby's first born, I might send them like one or two. But usually they kind of have the understanding that this work isn't going to publish for quite some time, and that I will share the images with them after the fact. So that's kind of how that process works.
And what's been the response to the article, to the pieces when they come out from the subjects?
For the most part, very positive. I mean, usually people are like, oh my God, I'm in the New York Times or I'm in National Geographic. And that comes with its own, just set of like, I don't know, weirdness, I guess is a weird word to put it, but kind of like that. But usually they're really excited about it. I think a lot of the topics are kind of these really simple concepts that are kind of just underreported that people aren't talking about as much. And I think they appreciate having their stories highlighted.
Cool. So let's talk about the Larson family. Where did that project come from? And you said you've been with them for 10 years. Can you talk a little bit about working on a long-term project with a family, not just individuals, but with a family?
Yeah, absolutely. So it started in college. We had a family project where we each got assigned a different town in around Rochester, New York. And I had gotten one particular town and I was out searching for a story and I wanted to do this like multi-generational farm originally. And I got a call from one of my classmates who's the fabulous photojournalist Emily Cask, who's down in New Orleans. And she called me, and at the time, Emily and I were kind of competitive with one another, which I don't encourage, but we were. And she called me and was like, "Hey, how's your story coming along?" And I was like, "Oh, it fell through. It's not going to happen." I was like, "How's yours going?" And she was like, "Actually, I met these quadruplets in a park." And I'm sitting there like, "Oh my God, of course you did. That's crazy." And she's like, "But, I don't really like love working with kids, and like I think it'd be really great for you to do. So we should find out if we can like switch towns because they were technically in a different town." So we had to ask our professor, but basically that night I went over there and I met the Larsons, and I met their parents first. The kids were already asleep. They were two. And I hung out with them and I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to work on this for like 2 weeks for school. I'll kind of come and go throughout that time period and spend time with you. How do you feel about that?" And they were like, "Oh my gosh, like basically free professional pictures, super cool." They loved it. And then it kind of started, and really quickly I bonded with their mom, Courtney. And I was like, I had this instinct like pretty early on, like within the 2 weeks of like, I think I want to work on this till these kids are like at least 18, if you'd let me. And I kind of just asked her, and I got so blessed because she was just like, "Yeah, that'd be great." And I was like, "Okay." And from there, I mean, I obviously was still in Rochester for a couple of years, I think two more. And so I revisited them frequently. And then yeah, once I graduated, I was just like, okay, I need to make it like my mission to go up there every year. And, in terms of working with them long term, the kids know me as Jackie, the girl with the camera, which is a great place to be. It's awesome to see them change and evolve and grow over the years. They've definitely gone through different phases. They've gone through like sticking their tongue out phase to like, I'm such a loser and I'm not cool phase, which is funny and amazing.
How old are they now?
They are going to be 13 in March,
Wow.
which is crazy. So, yeah, two of them just got braces the other day. They sent me pictures, which I was like, "Oh my gosh, I can't wait for like this entire next chapter that's like to come," right? You're going to have like puberty braces at like, potentially like just growing and uncomfortableness. And, obviously we also have a lot of conversations with the kids of like what they're comfortable with and what they're not and stuff like that. So,
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Now they're becoming more cognizant of, the work that you've done with the family. What is the kids' responses been?
for the most part, good. They're very understanding and welcoming that like I come up and I do this, and I spend like, between 3 and 6 days with them depending on what visit it is. And they definitely have moments. Usually they're more emotional moments, usually when they're like upset or mad at each other or something like that, where they'll kind of be like, "Go away." And I do try to like dance that line a bit where I, see if they're actually comfortable with it or if it's like actually a thing where they need me to go away. So,
Right.
it's kind of just like communicating with them and asking like, "Is it okay if I take a couple of pictures and then I go away?" But it's just dealing with, they're individuals, number one, right? Like there are four of them, but they are like such different kids. So, I have different kinds of relationships with each of them. So it's just kind of that like communication and asking and seeing where they're at and trying to like meet them where they're at. I have some years where, there's one of them that I feel like I'm probably closest to. And just because she's like really creative and imaginative and like a little artist. And, last year when I went, she like didn't want to really be photographed. And I just kind of respected it. And I was like, "Okay, no worries. Like, I'll take your picture when I, need to." And I can ask, "Hey, can I come hang out with you for like a half hour?" And then I can kind of back off from there. So that's kind of how that goes.
Well, that's cool. So, talk us like through because this is a fantastic project. I think it's what, Nicholas Nixon, right? Who did his wife and her sisters and the Seven Up series, the long term series. So this is a pretty fascinating project to do with still photographs. What is your day like with them?
It depends. I would say I try to actually go when they're either off from school or it's like summer, just because otherwise like half of my day is kind of like gone. Just because they're at school. I have photographed them at school twice, but that's kind of a periodic thing as needed. But yeah, I mean, I usually sometimes I stay with them, other times I stay with friends in the area. If I'm staying with them, I'm kind of like up when they're up. They're really independent kids, so they kind of have their own schedule. I mean, Courtney runs that house like a well-oiled machine. You know, they have a chore chart and they have a play schedule and they have reading time, and they kind of have these things like all scheduled out into different categories that also don't overlap with each other. So they're always doing like independent things, which I think is really important too, just like in their personal development. But I kind of bounce around from each of the kids. I see what Courtney's up to. A lot of it is very slow. A lot of it is just kind of hanging out, having my camera out. Other times it's hanging out and not having my camera out.
What are those times like with not having your camera out?
They're totally normal, right? Like I've known these kids since they were two, right? So like I have a great relationship with them. And whether it's, we're gonna go in the pool or we're gonna like go on a walk or we're going to watch cartoons in the morning together. Like it's all pretty normal. I've made them breakfast and stuff like that. I don't photograph when I make them breakfast, obviously, but like, it's just kind of like the normal hanging out with people that you know and are friends with. And it's usually a lot of fun because they're 12 and they're a lot of fun right now. Although they do love to remind me, they like love to do the loser symbol on the top of their forehead. It's like currently their favorite. So, and other times they want me to leave them alone and I just do. They go do iPad time and I bring a book and I go read. And, how many photos am I supposed to take of them playing on their iPads? So there's a lot of downtime. It's a lot of patience. It's a lot of hanging out. It's a lot of just kind of getting very comfortable being around them and like kind of coexisting around them.
Wow, and the parents are cool with like this long-term project.
Yeah, for the most part, I'd say we have had some like hiccups along the way of like things that they're comfortable with, things that they're not comfortable with, which have just been conversations. I definitely photograph Courtney a bit more than Cameron. He's a bit more uncomfortable with it long term, I'd say. Not to the point where he's not comfortable with the kids being in it, but I think he limits how much he's in it.
That's the
But
father.
that's the father, yeah. But he also works a lot. So like it also still is a very like authentic representation of kind of like who's around and what's going on throughout the day. But yeah, that's just kind of like again, like just having consent conversations, making sure everyone's comfortable. If it's like a really busy time of year, I don't go if they're like, hey, like now's not a good time. I think it's just listening to the people that you're working with. And I mean, I'm always missing moments with them, right?
Mhm.
Like I don't live in their neighborhood. I can't be there constantly. So it's a scheduled time that I'm kind of around and I come back around and I just accept the fact that like I'm going to miss things and I'm going to have to accept that and live with that. But I also remind myself like no one knows what I've missed except for me. And I don't know, I think as a photographer, you have to know that. You have to like accept that when you're working on long-term work because you really just can't be everywhere all the time. It's not possible.
Are there any of the other people that you photographed? Are you keeping in touch with them, or like the single dads, the single moms, the natural birth, any of those that you're keeping in touch with?
Yeah, I think over time I keep in touch with some people. I think some of the stories kind of came to a natural end, and that's okay. There have been like updates. We follow each other on social media. I think that's actually a huge thing, is just like Instagram. But like Sarah from the Single Moms by Choice, I've been in touch with her for a very long time. Treylani McCoy, who's also from the Single Moms. I also started that in college, that work, and that kind of evolved into the Single Moms by Choice story. And we're always in touch. Some of the dads from the single dad story, not all of them. I think it just kind of depends on like, the connection that's made. Maintaining relationships is hard and it's a lot to juggle sometimes with what we're doing. But, I kind of like try my best to do that because I think it's important. So it's nice to see how everyone's like growing and changing and coming into themselves over time, especially when you're working with really young kids. And like now it might be like 5 years later and seeing where they're at now. So I do kind of like to, I don't know, keep my toe in the pond and see what everyone's up to. I think Instagram definitely like helps me with that.
That's cool. And are these, or is the Larson project, is this going to be a book? Like, how do you envision showing this besides the website and social media? Is there any plans for you?
Yeah, I think I would love for it to be a book. I've always also wanted it to be an exhibition of some kind. It's something that I've never really had a desire to make a book in any other way, but this is the one that I've always been like, this will be a book someday. It obviously periodically publishes like in the media in different ways through different publications, whether it was like, it was first on New York Times's Lens blog, I think right when I graduated college. And then it was, when the kids were going to kindergarten on time because they were micro preemies. So it was a huge deal. And that was in Washington Post. So I kind of try to find like different hooks throughout it. But the end goal is like to have like a really beautiful book that kind of goes through all these different years and chapters of and periods of their lives and then have like a really beautiful exhibition.
Oh, nice, nice. We never talk about gear on the show. That's one of our tenets.
Okay.
No bros, no gear is basically our two things. But you work in such confined spaces and houses and very, very intimate situations. I just want to ask about the lenses that I don't really care about camera bodies, but I'm very curious to know what lenses you use to get these shots.
Lucky for yeah, I would say lucky for Molly. I'm like the least techie person ever. So I really don't even love to talk about it. But I'm mainly my kit is really basic. I have a 24 to 70, a 70 to 200, a 35 and an 85, and that's it. So when I'm with the kids, especially at their old house, I use a 24 to 70 all the time because I basically had to be at a 28 to get most of them in a frame because there's four of them, sometimes six with their parents, sometimes eight with their dogs. So it just needs like the flexibility of like I can only back up so much in a confined room. I will say I probably use my 24 to 70 the most or my 35. Those are probably the ones that I reach for most frequently just because of the confined spaces that I'm in. And otherwise, like I take portraits of the kids every year. For that, I either use like a 35 or an 85. But I don't even think I bring my 70 to 200 with me when I go any of these places. It's usually just like a one body, a flash and the 24 to 70 and the 35.
How
You
important is
know,
your flash to the work?
to the quadruplets work, not very. To other work, extremely, right? It's every situation's different. Like everyone is shocked to learn that the home birth story that I did was all flash because, which it doesn't look like flash because I bounced it, but it was like almost a like dark room with like candlelight, and that's
Wow.
how it was lit. And I tried so hard. I photographed it a little bit of both, where I would like shut the flash off and try to get it, but it was so dark that you like couldn't read things. And I finally was like, oh my God, I'm that crazy person who's now taking photos of a birth with a flash. That's like so invasive, or it always felt invasive to me. And I was like, I don't think I would ever do that. And then there I was doing it. And so it's a tool, right? Like anything else, if you don't have accessible light, you have to make some light. And that's, what I do. But with the kids, with the quadruplets, I feel like I barely ever use my flash. It's just like very specific situations.
Mhm. And do you have any advice for like younger photographers or not just young photographers? I mean, any photographer that's interested in doing long-term projects. Like how do you just for a minute, let's like talk about like budgeting your time and things like that. How do you do that? How do you make time for a long-term project?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was kind of two-part question. So I would
Yeah.
say for the first half of it, I'd say make a list of what you're passionate about, right? Like what kind of topics, what kind of stories do you want to tell, what's important to you, and I would what interests you. I have a running list that I've had since like from throughout my entire career that I add to over time. And when I'm feeling uninspired, I'm like, oh, maybe I can go work on one of these, and I think that's really important. Or just like even sub themes of like obviously there's parenting, there's caregiving, there's the LGBTQ community, there's immigration. Like find what you're interested in and how does that also connect to what's going on in our news today. I think that's really important and a great place to start. In terms of working on long-term projects and like balancing your time, like I said, you're never going to be able to be there all the time. So the first day that you can accept that, the easier it's going to be. But I would say, I feel like I learned a lot, right? Like with the single moms by choice, I was around a lot with those women, and then to actually see it edited down into the edit that the New York Times ran that I helped collaborate on, it was like they maybe ran like 5, 6 photos of each person. And I was like, oh my gosh, I spent like 30 days with Sarah for it to go down to 5 or 6 photos of Sarah. And that was just like such a crazy concept to me. So now, as I've been growing and working on these stories more, when I worked on a story with National Geographic, that was really interesting. It was the first time that I had worked on something where I had to like defend every day and justify it because I was getting a day rate for it, right? It was something I wasn't working on it independently. I couldn't just show up whenever I wanted to. I had to justify the day rate. And that was a really interesting process because for some of it, I had to like really advocate for more time and spending more time and getting to know people more. And for other things, it just kind of made me realize like, oh, I really don't need to be there as often as I think I do. And that was a really big learning curve for me. And that's just kind of experience. Like that's something that you're going to just like learn as you go. And it's really great for when you start like pitching stories to like be realistic and like, okay, how long is this actually going to take me? How many days do I need for this? Do I need to spend 2 weeks with people? Or could I realistically go for 4 days and spend full days and like do it that way? And I think having those kinds of conversations are important because at the end of the day, like this is your job, this is your livelihood. So like, you have to be able to justify those days not only to yourself and the people you're photographing, but also to the publications that you're working with.
Hey, it's interesting you brought that up because that was one of my questions was about editing. What's important to you in editing to get these pictures down? I know, like you said, you were there for like 30 days, and anyone that has done a longer term project or even, like a long assignment has to grapple with how do I get these down and get these to the editor? And then, of course, the editor's like, ha, we'll take two. Thank you. So how can you talk about your editing process a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's pretty solo, which is good and bad, I think. I think that's where some of those mentorships that I've done have come in handy. It's really nice to have other eyes on your work. But I think initially I always do like an initial tag through where I'm like, okay, like any photo that I remotely like or, think makes me feel something, I kind of tag and then I go through again. But it's one of those things like, right, it really varies because every editor is different. Every editor wants a different number of images. National Geographic makes you turn in every raw file of what you take. So like Kurt Muchler saw every single photo I took from my entire National
Really?
Geographic story. Yeah.
Like, I wish Molly was here because there's a photographer that we'll talk about it after the show. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's
I get
stress
out.
inducing.
Yeah.
I was literally like, you're going to see every photo that I take, like every mistake, every blurry, every
Yeah.
weird angle that I chose that I now regret. It's very interesting process. But then when you're working with the New York Times, I think I initially send like maybe 30 photos for a long-term story, maybe 20 to 30 if it's like super long term. Just to like show them it initially. And then I have like a wide edit of like 150 that I kind of end up passing off to be like, hey, things to consider. And then it's kind of a conversation between me and the editor from there about, if they're like, hey, I really like this frame, like do other variations of it or something like that. But I mean, the editing process, frankly, is just a lot of me. And so, it's always interesting because you're like, did I completely miss something? And did I pick an image that like, no one else would have. And that's where working with National Geographic is super interesting because Kurt and I would go back and forth, and he has a very intentional editing style. And he'd be like, in or out, really quick, gut instinct. And if I like hesitated, he's like, out. And I was like, oh my gosh, wait. So that was a really interesting process and very fun. But it's kind of interesting, right? Every person's perspective is different. So at the end of the day, like no matter what, really, unless someone else is completely editing the work, like you're getting my initial wide edit. So there could be tons of images that no one sees, right? And that haunts me a little.
Yeah. I like that gut react, like the in or out. It's pretty,
Yeah, very quick. He's very
pretty good.
fast with it.
So is it better for the photographer to edit or to get a second set of eyes for editing?
I mean, I think almost either way, right? The photographer is always editing. So I think that that is an important step in it, right? Because like you did take the pictures, but I do think that having a second set of eyes on any body of work is just always a good thing to have.
Okay.
And also like show it to like your like someone that's like not in our industry. Like I used to like send edits to like friends of mine that worked in like completely different sectors. Like my friend Kim used to work at like look at my edits and she works in like marketing because like she didn't understand it the same way we did. And I'd be like, do you understand the story? Like, do you still get this? And like, I can show my mom, but she's super biased. So like, that's she just be like, every photo's great. But like showing someone that's like an independent source is also like great and not just photo editors.
Yeah, that's why when I ask for criticism, I'm like, look, I have my mom to tell me how great I am. I need your opinion on this. Like,
Literally, literally. Like every photo can't be great. It's just not true.
are you working on anything now that you wanted to talk about in between the Larsons and anything new?
I'm not working on anything long term right now, which is kind of weird. It's kind of the first time that I'm not outside of the quadruplets. I am in a weird pitch phase where I've pitched like two really big long term stories about women and or reproductive health, depending on which one. And I'm kind of in talks with publications about them, but nothing's really started quite yet. But it's
That'd be pretty
only
important.
February, so we have time.
Yeah, they're going to be
Yeah,
pretty important subjects.
yeah.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Anytime. Thanks for having me. It was great.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. The work is gorgeous. We'll have links on our show page.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was lovely. Thanks for having me.
New episodes drop every Tuesday on 10fps.net or anywhere you get your podcasts. You can also catch back episodes on WLOI.org, as all episodes are recorded and produced at WLOI Loyola Radio in Maryland.